We'll get started. Welcome to the national webinar on supporting the use of licensing data. We're excited to highlight a new resource and TA opportunities from the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance, focused on collecting and using licensing data. For those of you who are not familiar with the Quality Assurance Center, I want to take just 1 minute to make sure that you're aware of our focus so that you can reach out to us when you have any technical assistance needs. Our priorities are to advance strong health, safety, and quality standards and licensing regulations, which is an important priority in the new federal regulations, support the development and enhancement of state quality initiatives, and enhance quality assurance systems with things like technology, data analysis, and research, things that make it possible for you as policymakers to successfully engage in continuous quality improvement. I'm Nina Johnson, TA Specialist for the National Center on Early Childhood Quality Assurance, and I'm happy to be joined by Kelly Maxwell, Co-Director for Early Childhood Research with Child Trends. We want you to leave this webinar with an understanding of what the Licensing Data Guide can help you with and opportunities for support of your collection and use of licensing data. And we're going to begin by setting the stage. Varying data systems and requirements may make you feel like this, right? You may have questions about your data. Like, what do we have to report, and what information has to go on our website? And how can our licensing data help make our policies and practices better? Kelly is going to talk about collecting and using data. What data do you collect, and what data do you need and want to collect? How do you collect and store data? And how can you use that data? So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kelly now.
Thank you, Nina. Let's move the slide. I'm happy to be here today and to talk about the Licensing Data Guide as a resource. And this presentation is going to highlight some of the points that are made in that resource, but we're hoping that you will also, after this webinar, go review the resource so that it can be a tool for you as you think about using your licensing data. So the first thing we're going to talk about is collecting data. States and territories collect a range of data, including, for example, basic information for licensed facilities, compliance with licensing regulations, and enforcement actions like fines and closures. States and territories vary, though, in what they collect, how they define particular data elements, how they collect the data, and how they store the data. And if I could just remind folks that we would like all the callers to mute themselves, and I think to do that you hit *96. It'll help with the background noise. Thank you. The Licensing Data Guide includes descriptions of licensing data systems from 3 states, Iowa, North Carolina, and Texas, to highlight some of the variation across states. The table in Appendix A, which you can see at least a portion of on this slide, includes a brief description of the licensing data system, talks about who uses the licensing data in that state, the perceived strengths and limitations of the system, and plans for improving the licensing system. The states vary in how they develop their licensing data system. Texas worked with a vendor. Iowa developed their system in-house, and North Carolina worked with the state's IT division to develop its system. So I think these are just 3 examples that demonstrate the variation that you see from state to state and territory in licensing data systems. The Child Care and Development Block Grant Act of 2014 and the Child Care and Development Fund Final Rule includes several provisions that will impact the licensing data that states and territories collect and publicly share. For example, states will need to post monitoring and inspection reports on websites. They'll also need to report the aggregate number of deaths and serious injuries for each provider category and licensing status. It can be a lot to keep up with, as one of those earlier slides that Nina showed of that person looking at this maze. And so the Licensing Data Guide is intended to help CCDF and licensing administrators understand these new requirements in terms of which data elements need to be collected and reported. Again, I'm hearing some feedback, so I would like to remind people to use *96 to mute your line, please. Appendix B of the Licensing Data Guide includes a table to identify data elements that are required to be collected as part of the CCDF regulation. The table is organized into two parts. The first part lists data elements that are likely in the licensing data system. The second part lists data elements that may be in the licensing data system or might be in another data system, and that would likely vary from state to state. This slide shows you an example more in close-up of that table, and it shows a few examples of what's included in the table. You'll see the green heading bar at the top of the table lists the name of the data element, provides a brief description of the data element, identifies a general category of the type of information required, includes the specific CCDF regulation citation, and information about where the data are supposed to be shared. It also has a place, you'll see in the second column from the left, for staff to note whether they already collect this or need to plan to add it. So again, our intention is that this can be useful for you to determine which things you already collect that are required and which things you might need to plan to collect. There are 3 examples shown on this slide of data elements states need to provide on their website. The QRIS rating element is also required for the ACF 801 report, as you can see in that last column that says shared in. Notice that the first data element is an annual aggregate number of serious injuries. Although the aggregate number is what's required to be included on a website, states will need to be sure they're collecting information about serious injuries at the program or provider level in a way that they can then produce that annual aggregate for each provider category like centers or homes and licensing status. Appendix B of the Licensing Data Guide includes some optional data elements that might be useful for states and territories to collect. Some of these are data elements that were recommended by the childcare.gov project, which is developing a national website to help parents search for childcare. And this slide provides a few examples of these optional data elements, such as enrollment of children by age and the technical assistance received by programs and providers. Having information about the age of children enrolled could help states better understand access issues for infants and toddlers, for example. Adding information about the type and cause of injuries and deaths might also be useful, for example, in guiding the development of training and support for providers. Now we're going to talk about how data are collected briefly. States and territories vary in terms of how they collect data. Some may collect data using paper and pencil, while some might use mobile phones or other technology in the field. Sometimes these data collection systems are developed by agency staff, and other times agencies contract with vendors to develop and support the data collection and storage of licensing data. I think we will see even more states and territories using technology in the coming years, and technology can certainly make it easier for staff to enter information and have access to resources while they're in the field. But I think we also realize that technology can bring its own set of challenges. For example, it might be harder for staff to learn how to use technology, and if working with vendors, there might be additional challenges depending on the relationship with vendor. Regardless of how data are collected, though, it's important to remember that staff should work to ensure that data are collected well so that people are confident in using the information. It might be helpful to review the procedures you have in place to support high-quality data collection. Are there, for example, ways to periodically check to see if licensing staff code violations consistently? If someone enters data from a paper form into an electronic data system, does someone double-check some of the data to make sure there weren't any data errors? So I would encourage you to think about however you and your agency collect licensing data, to think about what are the procedures you have in place to ensure that you can be confident in the data that you do collect.
Kelly, this is Nina.
Yes.
Going back to that slide, if you don't mind, I just had a couple questions.
Sure.
One of those questions is, given your experience with states, are states often using more than one system? Like, how common is it for states to store licensing, subsidy, and quality data in the same system?
So based on my experiences, I think they're most often separate data systems. So licensing might be in one system, subsidy might be in another, and quality, the QRIS, might even be in a third data system. So that raises other issues in terms of if there are questions that you want to answer that would require linking information from those three data systems, you have to think about issues and how to link them, but you also have to think about the quality of those data in all of those systems so that you can be confident that the data are collected well enough that you can use them to answer the question you want. That's a good point, that it is often more than one
Mute off.
states have, I think, from my experience. Okay.
All guests have been muted.
This next slide, can you hear me? It says all, I heard that all guests have been muted, but I'm hoping presenters are not muted. I'm going to assume you can hear me. So this slide talks about issues with licensing data. And the licensing data guide acknowledges some common challenges in licensing data and suggests some possible strategies for overcoming some of these challenges. So 3 common challenges are listed here. The first is that it can be hard or take a long time to add or change a variable in the licensing data system. It might also not be possible to generate a new kind of report to address current needs if the data system wasn't originally intended to generate this kind of report. So it's sometimes more difficult to generate new reports than ones that were created when the system was definitely created. And then finally, it might be challenging to link the licensing data with data from other systems, either because of challenges in the licensing data itself or challenges in the other data system you want to link to. So this is related to the question that Nina raised earlier about the fact that some of your questions might require you to link data from licensing system to other data systems, and that we recognize might be a challenge. And certainly states with older licensing data systems may run into more of these challenges than states who have newer data systems. Although it might not be possible to overcome all of the challenges, the licensing data guide describes 3 strategies that might be helpful in supporting states' use of their licensing data. The first is to use an existing data governance group or to create a new data governance structure. A data governance group is a team of people who help oversee the policies and procedures about data. They can develop policies, for example, about who can use the data. They can offer ideas for how to strengthen the quality of the data and develop procedures for ensuring data security. The licensing unit may not have their own data governance group, but there might be one for the larger organization, so it would be a good question to ask to find out if the organization has a data governance group, and if so, they would be a great group to turn to if you have questions or concerns about licensing data or would like some advice. A second strategy is to work on developing documentation about the data. This is sometimes called a data code book or a data manual. It describes each of the data elements in a data system and provides guidance about how to record or enter the information into a data set. So for example, It might specify that a variable called something like QRIS rating should be a number that ranges from 1 to 5, assuming there are 5 levels to the quality rating and improvement system. Having up-to-date documentation of the data can make it easier for people to understand the information you have and help everyone collect it consistently. Then the third strategy I want to say is that linking 2 data sets is easiest when there's a common unique identifier for the programs or individuals in the data set. But we know that sometimes unique IDs aren't possible. So in that case, I would encourage staff to talk with someone in IT or data management about small steps that might be possible to help combine information from 2 different data sets to help answer a question of interest. So for example, if you want to understand licensing violations for programs at various quality rating levels, it might not be possible to formally link those 2 data sets. You might, though, ask for QRIS rating data at a point in time, like June, and merge the QRIS data file with the licensing data file for those same programs so that you could at least periodically look at that information. I want to mention one other strategy. I think many licensing units work with IT or data managers to help manage licensing data. And I think it's really important that the program staff and the data staff have good relationships and talk frequently. If the licensing staff have a problem or need or come across one of these challenges, the IT folks might be able to come up with a creative solution that can be accomplished within the limits of the data system, but it really does rely on good relationships and frequent communication. We're going to talk next. Yep.
I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
So just I agree with you completely about the value of communication and investing to ensure that program staff and the tech IT staff can communicate, because as I'm sure many of you on the call have experienced and I've experienced too, it can be the case that the program staff and the IT staff seem to be speaking different languages sometimes. And so having someone who can either translate or making sure that there's a way to kind of formalize communication and ensure that the IT staff are hearing what the program staff want and the program staff are understanding the technical capabilities is huge. And also, before I forget, if you all on the call want to type in any challenges or strategies that you've had for overcoming your challenges into the chat box, please go ahead and do that. I have a few more questions for Kelly, and so feel free to type as I'm talking to her.
And particularly strategies. If people have great ideas for strategies for overcoming some of these challenges, we'd love to hear them. So share with your peers.
Yes, we would love to hear them. I'm sure your peers would too. So as states migrate from an older to a newer system, Kelly, are there important points that they should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know it's a lot of work to migrate from an old system to a newer system, and you might be tempted to be just bogged down in all the many steps that takes. But I would encourage you to think about that as an opportunity, and certainly think about it in terms of an opportunity to think about what data you need to answer your burning questions or the questions that you frequently get asked, and to try to include those data elements into your new data system instead of just assuming that you just need to transfer whatever it was you collected in the old data system and ensure that you're going to do it in the same data in the new system. I also think it's a time to think about whether you can drop data elements that you had in the older system that you really have not used or are not confident in the quality of, so that you don't just always continue to add data elements, add more to your system, but instead to be thinking about which data elements you can stop collecting so that you might be able to focus on some new data elements. I also think when you're transitioning to a newer system, it's really helpful to think about the other data systems you might want to link to, like quality and subsidy, and how you can build the new system to more easily work with those systems. So that may mean inviting representatives from those other data systems to help you think together about how the data systems talk to one another and things you could do when you're moving to your new licensing data system to help smooth that process. And then finally, I think, I was just going to say that finally my other thing is any time you're transitioning, it might be something that IT is really doing a lot, but I really want to encourage you to have people who are using the data systems on a regular basis involved in that process, in both developing the new system and developing a plan to transition from the old system to the new system, because they are the ones who really know the ins and outs of the data system and how they use it.
That makes a lot of sense. And then also it could be if the people who are using the system give input into the development of the system, they're more likely to have buy-in into the system and use it themselves.
Yes.
There's a note from Pennsylvania here that Pennsylvania has a team of business analysts that serve as liaisons between their program licensing staff, state IT staff, and contracted IT vendors. And the business analysts help with the translations back and forth. So that's an excellent example of one of the strategies that Kelly talked about.
It is, and I do find that sometimes there are certain kinds of people who can serve in that translation role. They understand the program side and they understand enough about the IT side. And so if you can find those in your agency, those are great people to play that role to help ensure that everyone's communicating. Good.
Yeah.
Now, Nina, I think are we going to do a polling question?
Yes, we're going to pull up a poll now. And for those of you who are typing in the chat box, feel free to keep typing once we finish with this. So what we want to know is, what do you use the licensing data for in your state or territory? Do you use it for evaluating your agency's practices, helping to improve quality, sharing with other agencies, something else, or you're not sure? I should say or you're not sure, because you can select multiple responses. So I'm going to keep filling it out. I'm going to broadcast the results, but I don't think that will keep you from responding to the poll. So it looks like as people are responding, most of you are using it to evaluate your agency's practices, which is really interesting, and we'd actually be very interested in hearing about how you're doing that, so feel free to type that into the chat box. And helping to improve quality. And again, please share your strategies there. I think that's very interesting. And then a decent proportion of you are sharing it with other agencies, using it for another purpose, and again, feel free to type that other purpose in to the chat box. And some of you may not be sure.
And I would love to see some examples of how you're using your licensing data to improve quality. That would be great to see.
Okay, thanks everyone for responding. I'll just take a few more seconds and then go back to the presentation. Cool, it looks like a dead heat between evaluating your agency's practices and helping to improve quality. All right.
Okay. Let's see if we can get back to the slides. Polling question. So now we are going to transition to another part of the licensing guide that describes various ways that CCDF and licensing administrators, as well as their partners, can use licensing data. And I'm going to highlight 4 of these uses in the next few slides. So the first way licensing data might be useful is to help evaluate policies, procedures, and practices and refine them as needed. And certainly that was something that was popular in the poll, that you said you do use your licensing data this way. 3 examples are listed on this slide. I'll say a little bit about the second example. Administrators could examine specific violations noted in the past year by each licensing consultant to help identify possible inconsistencies among staff in interpreting guidance about particular violations. And that data might be useful in revising the interpretive guidance documents or refining staff training to reduce inconsistencies. If TA is one of the enforcement action options, you could also examine licensing data to better understand how often TA is provided and for what kinds of licensing violations. You could certainly do that for any type of enforcement action as well. I want to note that the licensing guides includes a few examples of questions lists the data elements that would likely be needed, outlines some analytic steps, and offers suggestions for how the results might be used. So one of the sample questions addresses the issue of caseload. So if you're interested in that topic, I would encourage you to read the sample question number 1 in the licensing data guide.
Thanks, Kelly. And just to tag on to what Kelly was saying, in thinking about how data is used, it's also really critical to think about who uses the data. And the 3 states that we showcase in the report highlight how different populations like CCR&R, licensing staff, providers, the public, other state departments, and legislators use the data differently.
Great. So the next one, oh, here I've got to push the slide. There you go. So administrators can also use licensing data to support continuous quality improvements in their own work. Data about frequent licensing violations could inform future trainings offered by licensing staff or CCR&Rs. If licensing data can be linked with professional development data, then administrators might be able to see whether there's a relationship between provider participation in health and safety training and their compliance with some key health and safety licensing requirements. Identifying the standards or regulations that programs have the most trouble meeting can also inform the licensing unit's work in ensuring that providers understand the licensing expectations. Administrators might also use their licensing data to coordinate with other programs or agencies. It might be important, for example, to share compliance data with staff who monitor state pre-K programs if compliance is a prerequisite to receiving pre-K funding. Providing information about injuries to health consultants who work across the state could help them focus their efforts on the most common types of serious injuries. If there are differences in injuries for certain types of programs, then sharing that information could help TA providers better target their support. If licensing information can be linked with child care subsidy information, then it might also be possible to determine where children receiving subsidies go for care when a center or home closes, and to find out the licensing compliance of the next setting that the family chooses. I also want to note that one of the other sample questions in the licensing data guide focuses on the second example of examining the incidence of serious injuries in child care over the past 5 years and sharing that data with child care health consultants to inform their work. So you can learn a little bit more if you look at that section of the licensing guide.
And then Marcy in Pennsylvania noted that data is used to monitor the timeliness of completing annual inspections and to evaluate trends and sanctions. And that's a really good point and a really great way to use licensing data, I think, to help you improve consistency among staff and compliance among providers.
Yep. So on this slide, I want to point out one other possible way to use licensing data, and that is using it to address larger questions about the early care and education system. It might be useful to look at licensing violations for programs at each quality rating level to see if there are patterns of violations for programs at particular levels. Sharing aggregate information with providers or other key stakeholders can help foster discussion of the quality of early care and education. This information might include percentages of licensed programs by setting type in each region of the state, average capacity of children served in licensed programs, or average number of years programs have been licensed. As the final example, licensing data might be combined with subsidy and quality data to help state leaders better understand disparities in access to high-quality early care and education for some children, examining characteristics such as child race, home language, or family income. So I think this ends the overview of the licensing data guide. And now Nina is going to talk a little bit more about the technical assistance opportunity. But before we do that, does anybody else want to add anything to the chat box about how they've really found their licensing data to be useful?
Also feel free to put questions into the chat box, not just for Kelly or me, but for your peers. This is a good opportunity because there's a lot of people on this call to ask your peers questions about licensing data. So while you're thinking about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical assistance that we can offer. Our team at the Quality Assurance Center, including Kelly, is available to support you on topics like adding new data elements to your system, revising existing data elements, using licensing data to help answer questions like the ones we just talked about, and also strengthening the quality of your data using some of the strategies that Kelly highlighted. So if you're interested in this, some of you know me already, you're welcome to email me. If you don't, you're also welcome to email me. We're happy to work with you. And I wanted to note, too, the link to the data guide is included here, and it's also available up in the little box up above where it says Licensing Data Guide. If you click on it, and then you can click on Download File, and it'll bring the document up. So that's highlighted here, as well as a link to the childcare.gov project resource page, which highlights resources related to technology, data systems, and data governance. So we're going to go ahead and pull up a couple more polling questions now. These will not be broadcast to all, so please be honest. We're using this information to inform future webinars and make sure that we're meeting your needs. So I'll give you just a few more seconds, a little bit more time to complete this poll, and then I'll move into the next one. And I appreciate that some of you are taking advantage of this time to type into the chat box. These slides will be available, Sheila. Thank you for asking that question, and I meant to say that right away. Okay, looks like we have a critical mass of voters for this poll, and so I'm going to move on to the next one. So you can choose multiple responses to this question, and again, we will not broadcast these results. And the question is, how might you use the guide to support states and territories' use of child care licensing data as a reference? Would you use it for required or optional data elements, when examining the use of licensing data for continuous quality improvements, when you use data to evaluate practices, when you examine the use of data for questions about the early care and education system, and or for data sharing with other agencies? Or maybe at this point you're not sure. Okay, this is really helpful for us. Brett Skinner put a question in the chat box. Anyone have creative data asks for IT when new systems are being developed? So I'm going to move on to the last polling question. And so when you finish with that polling question, please respond to Brett's question. It's a great question. And Kelly, if you have a response to that, that might be appreciated as well. So the next question is, what additional technical assistance would be helpful on the topic of licensing data? Adding new elements, revising data elements, using licensing data to help answer questions of interest, strengthening the quality of data, or something else which you can type in, or nothing. And Kelly Maxwell is responding to your question, Brett. And Kelly, if you want to go ahead and talk about that now, that's fine too, while we wait for people to respond.
Okay, and so I will stop typing and just say, you know, I'm not sure I have the magic creative data ask, but what I would encourage you to do is to talk to the users of your licensing data and to see what's on their wish list and raise that with IT. The other thing is just asking some general questions about IT, about how, if they work with other data systems, what have they learned in doing this in other data systems that they can share with you, or things that they think you should consider from a technology perspective.
That's a great idea. I heard good advice from someone on this too, that when you're thinking about what you want for a data system, it's important not to limit your thinking in terms of what the financial or resource limitations are. I know that sounds crazy, but it's almost more helpful to start with a big idea and then pare it down based on limited resources than to limit your thinking because you have limited resources.
That's a great point. And I think the other point is if you think that you want to be able to add new data elements or you want some flexibility, I would note that to the IT folks at the beginning because it might impact the way they're developing the system that would allow you more or less flexibility when things pop up in the future, which we know always happens.
Good point. So go ahead and keep typing. I'm going to go back into the presentation. And I just want to take some time to thank all of you for your participation. I know it's difficult to participate in a call when there's so many folks on it, but you've been great about typing into the chat box. And we have a few more minutes left, so I hope you'll all stay on because your peers have some questions. Yeah, so there's another one just echoing that this is important and they're interested in the response to Brett's question. And then we have some other folks typing as well. I think it is an interesting question, and we're happy to work with you and thinking this through more carefully. So we'll give folks just a couple more minutes to type. And Kelly, do you have any other reflections just in thinking more about this?
No, just really encouraging people to think about how they can use their licensing data. I think that it's a rich source of information, and it might feel overwhelming, but you could just think about one piece of that and work on one piece at a time, and eventually you'll get the whole thing done.
Thanks, Kelly. And Nance reminded me that our center will have a licensing community of practice. And so that's an opportunity for folks in licensing at different levels of licensing to get together on a regular basis and talk about things that are coming up for them. So this could definitely be a topic of focus in that licensing community of practice. And we'll send more information out on that when it's available. Then we have another comment from Melissa. Not sure if this is creative, but it's extremely helpful to be able to get as many data elements as possible for reporting. Yes, always more helpful to have too many elements at your disposal than too little. I couldn't agree more. IT is not always available to get the information requested as timely as you may want or need it. I think that's definitely true. It's better to have a lot and then have to pare it down than not have enough. Okay, we'll go ahead and leave this up for a while if you all want to keep talking and having a conversation with each other. Kelly and I both really appreciate your time and all of your great questions and your participation. And we hope you have a good afternoon. Again, I'll leave this box open. When I hang up, we're not going to close the room because we see that you have some questions for each other, and I think this is a good time for you all to communicate. Clearly, it's something that's needed, and so I'm looking forward to the licensing community of practice. Really quickly, since Dana's question just came up, there are discussions about using data analytics software to do more real-time analysis of data in Hawaii. Well, yeah, okay, that's wonderful. That'll give you some really good data.
Yep, I think it's important to think about building capacity of licensing staff to use the data system that you have so that you don't always have to rely on IT to do everything that you need it, because oftentimes IT is really balancing multiple priorities across multiple units. But I want to add my thanks to you guys for joining this webinar, and I really hope you'll use the Licensing Data Guide as a resource to help you think about next steps for your system.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We hope you have a great afternoon and happy holidays. Take care.